Meneses will speak about 25 to 40 minutes, and thereafter Professor Makoni will engage in conversation with her. And after that, we will have our Q&A session, which will be moderated by Raphael today. The last half an hour is called our after party session, and this is an informal session with no formalities, and we're able to have a free discussion. And you're welcome to stay if you would like. And also, while Dr. Meneses is speaking, please feel free to write your questions in the chat box. So I now have the privilege of introducing Dr. Meneses, who will speak about food as knowledge, interconnecting the global South. Maria Paula Meneses, a Mozambican scholar, is a principal researcher at the Center for Social Studies, University of Coimbra. Her research focuses on the political history and social legal complexity of Southern Africa, especially in Mozambique, Angola, and South Africa. At the heart of her interests are the relations between knowledge, power, and societies. Her work has been published in journals, books, and reports in several countries, including Mozambique, Spain, Portugal, Senegal, United States, England, Germany, Colombia, amid others. Dr. Meneses, you have the floor. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good night. I don't know where we are in the world because we are all somewhere in the time frame. So I hope I didn't miss anyone. Thank you, especially to Professor Makoni for the invitation. And it's really nice for me to be now here. I am currently in Spain, in the Basque country, to share with you some insights about the way we have been thinking about knowledge production, and especially relating to the role of women, where women act, how do they act, and what is their role in knowledge production. So I'm trying to address food as epistemology, trying to contribute to a broader debate on the interconnectedness of Africa with the world beyond that overshadowing presence of colonial representations in the continent. I'm going to share with you a couple of slides, and I'll try to explain why they are meaningful for this presentation. This is a painter I really enjoy. It's a scene from Nairobi, but if you really see, the center of the scene is the market, it's the food, and food is interaction, is discussion, is socialization. Paraphrasing Francis Namjo, it's conviviality, it's about talking with the others. So I think that that is something that is really important for us to think about. Why is this topic interesting to me? And I thank very much the presentation made. When I have to share with you that my own trajectory, and I studied in the first and the second world, because when I was a student, two of them existed. So I did my academic training initially in the former Soviet Union and later on in the United States. It became clear to me then that educational projects proposed by these two countries share similarities that enable us Africans to enter the academy on our own right, with knowledges and experiences that were not just data, that were not just information, but were knowledge, thought, and practice, and produced from other perspectives that did not fit quite often the modern rational models. One of the first questions that I still work on are witchcraft accusations, and this was one of the most blunt cases of the conflict in terms of interpretations. But I still do research about with traditional healers on this topic. In short, we could move, we could travel, then was easier than now with the COVID, but the big question is that our knowledges could not travel with us. And in this context, myself, together with other colleagues from Africa, we used to discuss that more permanently experienced episodes of cognitive injustice. So to speak, we always see as underdeveloped, being developed. That was sort of words to express that we are not yet that advanced, we were sort of immature. And this sort of abyssal thinking that started to be theorized in the Bandung Conference in 1955 requires us to overstep that bridge, that big abyss that separates the North which is the modern rational scientific knowledge, from the other knowledges that usually are seen only with local, traditional, old value. We have to face an epistemological shift to recover the idea that there are alternatives to the crisis we are facing. And I found it rather interesting that at this COP26 meeting, we never spoke about Ubuntu as a reconnection between myself, with my ancestors and the environment. And we always talk about the Anthropocene crisis as these other knowledges and ways of knowing had no interest so forth. So 2 questions, let me see if I can shift the thing on. I think I jumped to, yes, this is the second slide. 2 overshadowing questions structure this presentation. I'm trying to make sense of the things. Can women's knowledge in the form of recipes generate alternative epistemic reflections that are part of this network of knowledge that conforms the Indian Ocean? Can this knowledge produce a more sophisticated image of contacts and historical narratives that extend far beyond in time from the colonial imaginary? These 2 questions that I'll try to address here with you, I think are fundamental to understand a broader question on how to humanize our knowledge, moving beyond this condition, as I said, of cognitive injustice that still characterizes most of what is going on in the global South. Indeed, does the notion of knowledge as the same value to all people, to all cultural contexts? And before engaging with these 2 reckoning questions, let me share with you some critical stances that will put the question in a broader context. Samir Amin addressed it a while ago, that the construction of African context as a periphery has to be seen as a political, epistemic, and ontological exercise aiming at generating an explicit definition of the geopolitical and epistemological space of the North as the center. Whenever we define something as a periphery, it's because there is a center. Quite often, we don't explicitly refer to it as the center. And if I will ask you how many cardinal points are in the world, probably I'll come across 4 or 6 or 8, but never with the impar number. Indeed, they are 5, because there is always a center that defines the North, the South, the East, and West. So it's this question, unnamed, of the center that we have to start addressing. And this unnamed is the imperial global North. And seeing from this perspective, Africa continues to be a particular case. And in quite often, this idea of periphery has been translated as underdeveloped, backward, on the path to civilization that is the product of a chronos time, a sequential time of European modernity. I have nothing against this model of the global North. I think it's a useful model to explain the North Atlantic region, but I think that my problem is when it becomes an imposition to understand the all over the world as a single model, one size fits all. My problem really is when, based on this premise, modern scientific thought insists on imposing this abyssal fracture that divides the North and the South. And South, as I said, usually in the plural, are seen as little spaces not connected among themselves. My big question at the end, and I'll try that we get into in our discussion, can we see the North as an exception and see that the global South indeed as a metaphor of these spaces of oppression, negation, subalternization as the majority of the world? Let's see if I can make the point across. Because the ideas I'm trying to share here with you require a reflection about the notion of what is universal knowledge. And here one has to be careful about the distinction between universal. Every knowledge thinks about the world, about the universe, and the notion of universality. And this question is important because European philosophers have presumed since Plato, as back as I've been going, that to know is to completely translatable, meaning that is a semantic prime common to all minds and languages. However, if people have fundamentally different intuitions about knowledge, as numerous academic works suggest, the Eurocentric philosophy will have overlooked a significant abyss between cultures, including how cultures interact among themselves. And scholars such as Michel Raff-Trouillot, Suleiman Bajij have highlighted evidence against the universal shared notion of knowledge would indicate that epistemology, in Eurocentric epistemology, in cognitive science, is simply an exercise in the way the global north talks about knowledge and not an enterprising and attempting at discovering the foundation of coherent methods for being justified through beliefs. So this is important to understand this big discussion about fake news and so on. When did they start and how do we produce these coherent methods to justify the production of a regime of truths? Then to think about the world requires to study it as it exists, rooted in particularity, in context, evocative of multiple layers of sensibilities, cultural and knowledges. Hello? That are very localized and express different political choices. And this brings the question about the academia. As the university where most of us have been trained is not really just a product of European modernity, but also we have to address, if you want, we can talk about it later, the role of other universities that don't follow that part of the modern university, being it the Humboldtian or Bonapartean model. So this is a legacy that is fundamental to acknowledge that if you are serious about democratizing democracy, we have to open up the discussion about knowledges in the world. And Suleiman Bajij mobilizes a distinction between two types of universals that, in my view, is rather important. So he defines a verticalized universal, polarized, and the lateral universal, off-centered, horizontal. And if the first defines an apprehension of the world from a particular position and aims to, from that particular position, to propose itself as the center, the second proposal of this horizontal universal, what we see is a journey, it's a traveling, it's the nomadism between persons and communities without any absolute point of reference from which to be judged or evaluated. So it means that locations such as Athens, Paris, Baghdad, Fez, Timbuktu are all areas of philosophical reasoning where multiple references are connected since a long time ago, drawing together intellectual and plural traditions. And these movements of debate, transference, and translation were never and will never be linear. They are intertwined, they cross seas, continents, complicated the role and implications for our academic knowledge. So the great colonial division between the humanity of the logos and the anthropos feeds exactly this distinction between imperial languages of civilization, which is science, and indigenous languages that express the incommensurable ways of knowing. So that's how I'm trying to address the questions of languages in a meta-analysis. The challenge is then to think from the global south calls for recognition of a plurality of its epistemological aspirations. It's therefore an epistemological south and not a geographical one, consisting of multiple epistemologies produced when and where useful experiences are generated, produced, taught, and different historical, political, and cultural contexts. So we have to address knowledge contextually and not just as an abstract context. Thus, by occupying epistemology, which is really an occupying from this perspective, oppressed silence groups, those who not usually count as humans because their knowledge is just a part of the subhumanity that lives in the South. They are not part of that universe of the global North, can claim their humanity by representing the world as their own in their own terms. This epistemic struggle is a struggle to overstep what Valentin Mudimbe has called the colonial library, whose texts are still the predominant corpus of interpretation of Africa in circulation, representing a body of knowledge aiming at translating and deciphering the African object in order to dominate it. I know that some of you speak and use the concept of Lusophone Africa, and that it brings indeed a question: is the Portuguese the only language that we activate in our context? I'm not sure, as in my own experience, we have carried out since independence a lot of work to transform the Portuguese as an official language into a language of communication. I think by now 40% of the population are speakers of Portuguese, but still we have bilingual education, and the national language continue to be the language of majority of people activated. So this idea of Africa as a singular monoculture project has to be thought if seen only from the perspective of the former metropoles that have created the idea of Lusophone, Anglophone, Francophone, Africa as the key references. Through the close links between existence, knowledge, and power across the Indian Ocean, many women who were responsible for and are women really the key responsibles for the survival of their families and communities on a daily basis. They have been dehumanized and transformed into objects, bodies without knowledge, that need to be brought into the discussion. That's what we have been calling the little voices in history. So in the picture on the left, it's a former colonial plantation house, and on the bottom you have the women they were just selling rice that had been just produced from that year production. But in two cases, who cooks, who cements the community are essentially women. So identifying how these contemporary multiple abyssal lines, being it the line of knowledge, the line of gender, the line of language, all these lines and the underlying power, knowledge, existence relation is fundamental to overcoming relations based on silencing and subalternation, and to enabling the radical co-presence of human beings with their forms of knowledge. So I think the sense of belonging to places through taste, and taste, we usually don't pay attention to taste as a key element in knowledge production, enables us to apprehend the role of sensory and affective connections that are forged and cement the communities we belong to. An approach to an ecology of tastes, using the different tastes as elements of connection and separation and differencing, allows us to discover bridges between the known and the unknown, the familiar and the strange, the spoken and the silence, ensuring the existence of women in the struggles against oppression. And in my view, these knowledges are fundamental to the elaboration of an alternative way of thinking about alternatives, helping to consolidate proposals towards a post-abyssal thinking. This part of my presentation takes up the challenge advanced by Boaventura de Sousa Santos of the Epistemology of the Self. I think you are familiar with it, in an attempt to understand all food, evoking other stories, other narrative, other cultural contexts and processes, enables other ontologies, other beings to be present as fundamental pieces in the construction of networks of knowledge through the struggles of these women. Daily life in the coastal areas of Mozambique has taught me a lot about the importance of networks of connection, travel, trading, family connections, religious pilgrimage, integrate people of the Indian Ocean, bringing them together, adding tastes to this network, helping consolidating communities. However, if you see it from the north, what we have seen is basically the links between the former colonies and the colonized, which are totally dissipate all these elements of knowledge production. To take seriously the challenge by Dipesh Chakrabarty that we need to provincialize the history of the world, it requires rethinking the relations between the spaces which shape cultures and the areas of contact between them. And I think this is the basis to forge what Sanjav Subramanian has been called for a world made of interconnected histories with similarities, confrontation, different interpretations, but above all, thinking that history It's a box to be opened, to be discussed, to be disputed, and to be rewritten permanently. However, I think quite often, even when we are at the level of rewriting history, the role of food and tastes and also traveling are not usually taken into consideration. So when we think about Mozambique, which is part of East Africa and profoundly interconnected with the Indian Ocean, what we see is that being it in Mozambique, in the Mauritius, in other places up to India, what we see is in the markets, in street food stalls, in kitchens, at the hands of women, we see how products are transformed into culture, an experience that is filled with aromas, tastes, textures, and above all, affection and care. Following a Padurais challenge, I came to understand the social life of food as objects that travel. And cookery lessons taught me the educating the senses is a radical need, really, if we want to overstep this abyssal thinking. By demonumentalizing here, one of the claims I have is that most of this way of preparing kitchen, it's unwritten. There are oral archives, which is a strong component of the African hello of the African heritage, but at the same time, we don't see quite often how these recipes entail indeed an archive of knowledge that has been shared across generations, and especially it's a claim, as of what Bajij has been telling us about, to demonumentalize the written record and to pay attention to kitchen and the performative in the kitchen as a way to understand how we act in the world. Studying food and knowledge involved in its preparation is a dynamic way. It requires circulating between different contexts, but it helps us to understand the biographical trajectories and meaning linked to the use of particular objects that come to be part of the food. And through the social history of food and those who prepare it, it's possible to recover networks of reciprocity, solidarity, rediscover knowledges and stories that still wait to be told. I've done archival work in Mozambican islands, Zanzibar, Mombasa, Cairo, Mumbai, and Goa. And all these places came to me to be perceived as part of a cosmopolitan network and zones of contact of transcontinental cultural circuits. And this sensuous description of food that we encounter in this context are part not only of Mozambique, but also share elements of connection with the Indian Ocean, linking with that idea of creolization as a world made of parts, but transforming in a totality, as the colleagues from the Caribbean have been telling us about. Although at this part, we have also to pay attention to the strength of the colonial representation of this area of the world, and I'm not talking about Mozambique, where the colonial project sought to impose three referential civilizational references: hygiene, order, and beauty, that led to the transformation of different forms of preparing, cooking, and so on, as being unhygienic, being not proper, and to be removed from the picture. I think that when we prepare a dish, it involves different levels of learning. It's a huge laboratory where, if we would translate it to modern science, we would learn about chemistry, about physics, about biology, but above all, it's a performative. In the cook, the family, the friends, everybody takes part in the act, in preparing and eating and commenting and appreciating the food. So it's the meanings of the conversation imply really that is a way of consolidating the community and making bridges across that group. When we prepare food in kitchens, knowledge is appropriated, incorporated into practical experiences. And this is indeed, for example, and I think the colleagues from South Africa will understand it, the preparation of the curry, which by tasting it, we can almost define where from the person that prepared the curry comes from, because of specificity of the tastes, the different levels sedimentated in the plat. But it's a way also of expressing not only thoughtful practice, but also corporeal knowledge, pointing to the fact that it's an experience through the body that has to be perceived as such. So the recognition that knowledge does not lie only in the mind, but also is practiced in the experience through the various senses is something that we have to bring into the discussion, to open up the idea that the way we interact with the world is not just through our ears and vision, but involves all these emotions and sensuous preparations. It also points out that we need a grammar of knowledge that is usually, as I said, carried out orally. And I think in that sense, we quite often, if we go with the word, we miss the process of production. And here you'll see vada pau, bajij, acará, cozai, cozé, that up to acarajé in Brazil, but all of them have this, the structure, the approach to prepare this plate is it's the same. There are variants, obviously, but it's very interesting to see what it means and how, especially the way street food has been occupying. It's a way of occupying the public space and make a statement about other cultures in our lives. It's very important. Now, in the few moments I have to, before I finish, two small moments. One is when I was younger, so independence in Mozambique came when I was about to enter secondary school. Bajij were a plate of the periphery of the city, of the Black neighborhoods, and suddenly with the crisis, but above all with the arrival of Black population to the core of the white city, which was left empty by the Portuguese departing, it meant that new tastes, new products, new ways of cooking invaded the city. And suddenly in the schools we were offered bajijs instead of sandwiches and the cookies. So it was also a way of rethinking about the city, rethinking about the products that we didn't know, some of us, about their existence, the way of producing, but also about reshaping and occupying the city. So in other words, I think bajijs became indeed a symbol of our identity, and I could go on and on about the role of bajijs in political economy of women today in Mozambique, but it's still also the way people cook, the way people eat. It's quite often the same. It depends on the times of the day. When you in India cook, in Mumbai, street food is basically the vada pav for lunch. In Mozambique, and from what I saw in Ghana, it's also especially for breakfast. But still, it's important for us to understand the role of this street food for people that are entering the city and that are occupying it, the workers. So it's a question that mixes gender, mixes a class approach, and it's a way of understanding who really occupies and lives in the city. So I think that we have to shift away from that approach, from the rational approach, the modern rational approach that insists that knowledge is not embodied in us, but to understand how the various senses that we embody are indispensable, are vehicles, fundamental vehicles for understanding the world, our world, which is still controlled by reason. So I think that it's important to understand that the aesthetics that is a very interesting discursive field in European philosophy since the 18th century, has been claiming that taste is unconscious, subjective, too intimate for any rational output. I think we need to open, to think from the South, and these are bodies with transporting knowledge embodied really in their essence. And we cannot go to understand the global South without these corporeal experiences, which are unthinkable without understanding the role of senses, sensations, where taste is fundamental. So it means we still have a lot to understand about the global South and about the connections in the global South. So in this image, what I'm trying to say is how far the trip of the vada pav from Mumbai until Acarajé in Brazil went through, and especially to recognize the work of the enslaved women that were object of extreme violence, but traveled with them, kept with them, not only the products, but also the recipes and the capacity of adjusting the recipe as a form of insisting on their identity, on their claim that they existed with knowledge as power prior to the colonial intervention in Brazil. So I think in order to overcome any case of exclusion, abyssal exclusions, as we insistently see in the world, it means that we have to experience mutuality, feeling the world by being aware of the symmetries, and above all to recognize that the way to approach the world is to recognize that our knowledge is limited, and to be aware that ignorance, curiosity, if you want, is a key structure to understand the world. So we have to experience, and to experience, even if you want to understand the violent colonial violence, one way to understand is how these women, for instance, in Brazil, are not still the preparation of the acarajé that is sold in the streets. Essentially, it's also seen as a statement about bodies that experienced the extreme violence of slavery, survived and insisted in their presence, occupying that space. So the rationale of this epistemology of the self emerges when we live together, eating, savoring, tempering conversations on knowledge, while also savoring affection and care. Because these are foods that when we feel lonely, I don't know about you, but each time I travel, I hope no one from the customs services is attending this lecture, but usually when I travel, half of my suitcase is food, coconut, samosas, and so on and so forth, because that's what I miss about home when I'm not in Mozambique. So I end with the words of Mia Couto's, the beads thread about grandmother Nzima, when she says, cooking is the most private and risky act. You can put tenderness or hatred into the pot. You can pour flavoring or poison into the pan. Who would be responsible for the purity of the sieve or the pestle? How could I leave this intimate task in the hands of some anonymous person? She's talking about the importance of cooking for a grandson. Unthinkable. Never in my life subjecting yourself to a cook you had never ever seen. Cooking isn't a job. Cooking is a way of loving others. And in a time when we really need to, after this COVID thing that is impinging upon our lives, and I'm really sorry I cannot attend a physical meeting where we could share some food and some affection. Food, it's about a way of knowing the world, and above all, a way of caring and loving the others. And thank you very much.
Right. Raphael, where is Raphael?
Yes, thank you very much, Maria Paula, for your very interesting presentation. Makoni now will open the discussion by asking some questions and making some comments about your presentation. And soon after, we're going to open the floor for the participation of everyone. So Makoni, if you could start, please.
Yes. I have a couple of, they're not questions as such. I want you to help me clarify for myself a couple of issues that are not very clear to me at the moment. You talked about issues of universals. Are you saying that universals are what we should aim for, or universals are what we should seek to undercut in our research and research practice? Let's say from Epistemologies of the South, are universals that which we are trying to aspire towards, or universals are those ideas that we are seeking to undercut?
Can I answer now?
Yes, you can answer, then we can continue talking.
Okay, what I was trying to say is that there are two ways of addressing universals. One, it's the North-centric approach And I can give you a very quick example. We talk about, that is by Paula Meneses. We talk about philosophy, and then we talk about African philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, indigenous philosophy. So we always put adjectives in order to locate them.
Yes.
So the question is that if we are talking about a universal approach, then we have to recognize the context where those discussions are, those reasonings are taking place, and to create the conditions then to perform an intercultural translation across them, because quite often we don't understand each other. I was this morning in a session, I had to go to a class this morning, and someone was talking to me about body territory. And I was saying, oh, I'm going to translate it into Xishangan, which is my mother tongue. It doesn't exist. So quite often what I'm trying to say is that it makes sense for the struggles in Brazil, but we have to be aware that all our knowledge is situated, is contextual, and I need to recognize my ignorance about that process and to ask my colleagues to explain it to me. So in that sense is what Suleiman Bajij calls about horizontal, universal of dialogues. So we talk, and I think it's what we do a lot when we have these meetings, the banquets in my region. We can start with a proverb, which is usually a question, and then discuss about it around us without an hierarchical decision about the end of the conversation. And I think it's what I would call a more democratic approach to discussion, instead of saying that is the frame of reference, we need to go from A to B. That is already defining how I am supposed to think, instead of seeing that the discussions, the conversation are horizontal and can lead us to places we are not anticipating.
Okay. So horizontal universality gives rise in your mind to something like interconnected universality, whereas vertical universality gives rise to imperialistic universality, where my knowledge is supposed to be, what is true of me is supposed to be true to everybody. Right. Okay. Now, my next question, continuing with this, I like the idea of food as ontology. When you shift to history using food as ontology, if food is your ontological framework, let's say for history, can you eat history? Can you smell history? Does history have a taste? Can I say, for example, I can smell the history of Mozambique in this particular town? Can I say I can feel the history of the colonial struggles of Mozambique? In other words, once you move into the idea of food as ontology, you are therefore proposing another set of conceptual terms to talk about history, which are connected with food. Can I say I'm eating the history of Mozambique?
What I'm trying to, I prefer to give examples.
Oh yeah, okay.
I have been interviewing women who supported the liberation struggle, but don't have the name of guerrilla women. So they're, as they say, we are just women.
Yes.
And one of them, when I said, so how was it during the war? She had this sentence, during war, we starved, but it was a sweet starvation because we knew we were going to be liberated. So there is a taste
to that, yes.
To the liberation struggle, which happened long ago. And then I asked later on, so what about now? And she said, now we are in a bitter situation. So even when we don't pay attention, quite often we activate tastes to perform and to express the way we understand. Getting back to history, I was really, when I went to do research in Goa, in the archives, I was really amazed by the informations I gathered about what people were carrying from place to place. But first is the smell of the archive, because the archives is a special smell.
Yes, yes, yes.
Those of us who work in archives, we know there is a smell there. And some of us have problems with allergies and so on and so forth. But there is a smell in the archive. But what was interesting was that I was addressing the questions of food, and in order to understand food, I had to go through the customs books to understand where food moved from place to place. But what was interesting is one of the books, Monson books, which were the books that kept the information about what came from the kingdom and back to the kingdom. There was a very interesting information about, I've forgotten now which king it was. I think it was King John III in Portugal, who had understood, in my opinion, that it was impossible to keep India and Brazil at the same level, and asked specifically for pieces of mango trees to be taken from Goa to, now I forgot the name of the capital in the north of Brazil. I remember the city in Grão-Pará, to be taken to Grão-Pará, because so there is a special order for these trees to be taken with 3 people. So there are specific instructions, and you can imagine how little those boats were, and there was water to water the trees in order for the mango trees to travel to Belém do Pará. So if you travel to Pará, you'll see on the streets lots of mango trees. Those mango trees come from that decision. So there is a taste of connection that we have to understand the history of that connection. On the same books, there is another information interesting, that there was a lot of erosion in Goa going on the shores, and they had identified in Brazil a tree that enjoyed very much the sand context, and they were going to export it to Goa, especially, as the archives say, because the people in Brazil don't understand the value of that tree, who has very nice fruits, who make a wonderful spirit. And obviously, you know, I'm talking about cashew trees and the role of cashew trees in making nipa and other things that are very also predominant in Goa. So if I don't taste, I can't understand the weight of history of these contexts, because we don't pay attention to it. We just talk about products were exported. It's not products, it's knowledge, it's efforts, our people's lives. I tried to follow the lives of the 3 persons that went to Brazil, 2 men and a woman. I managed to get some information in Brazil, but then they are lost. They stayed in Pará, and we don't know where they are. But there are little stories of someone, if I will ask, so what was your task? To take 10 pieces of 10 trees, mango trees, and there were specific mango trees, because there are 29 varieties of mango trees. There were 5 specific varieties of mangoes to be taken to. So those are tastes, in my opinion, that ontological expressions of the contribution of other actors to what we have currently in the world.
Let me give another concrete example, then I'll ask another question and give back to Raphael. I went to Kenya. Vicky, Professor Talewa is around here, and in their meetings they serve food quite a lot, and there's a lot of samosas that they eat in the beginning of their meetings at Laikipia University. I never associated samosas with being integrated into an African context. But you could see from the enthusiasm with which they were eating that these samosas were really part and parcel of what they regarded as food. Right. So when I was reading your work, I could see the interconnectedness of how our food may be a very useful way of trying to understand histories. And then because I was staying on campus, I used to go to the kitchen, and they treated me very well, and I would talk to the cooks, etc. And I got to know more about the connection between Laikipia University and the other parts of Kenya by just talking to these women where they bought the food, who cooked what, and so they'll say, "Oh, do you want to eat this?" And I say, "No." They say, "Oh, we can cook it differently." Then you would ask, and I could understand your case about how you can use food as an ontological framework for understanding history. For me, coming from a slightly different discipline, what I would want to do is to explore how I can use food as an ontological framework to talk about language. I would pursue it like this. I would say language, like food, like place, smells. Different languages have different smells. They taste differently when you are talking about them. And the argument I think I want to make is it's not because languages don't smell. Languages smell, it's only that we frame them. The conceptual diction that we use to talk about language does not include what you're talking about as food, as ontology. So that's where I think your work is very fascinating, because it opens up a bigger avenue. We all eat food. We are what we eat. So in a way, I can see why it makes a lot of sense to connect studies of history, studies of language to what you eat, right? Because that is one of the most relevant things that you are engaged in. How you eat, how you speak are all connected. And in some cases, when you are eating, is part of an interactional event. Yeah.
No, you are absolutely right, and I think this comment is very important to me. But even sometimes we have, as I said with Bajij, that they are different words, but the thing is similar. So instead of seeing separations, we see interconnections.
Yes, we see interconnection. Yes,
and that is what I'm really very interested in, because, for instance, now in Malawi, I think they call it also Shima, but it's Dugali in Kenya. It's World Heritage.
Yes.
But it's not just a World Heritage of Malawi, because we all eat Shima, Ugali, whatever.
Sadza in South Africa.
Sadza,
yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I was asking, so how did you decide? Oh, because this is ours. I said, well, there are small differences, but this is part of a big project. We all cook it. And then I said, and the most interesting is that how we have appropriated maize, which came from Mexico in the 16th century.
Yes.
Appropriated it so quickly that it developed other meanings, other words, other way of. But we have to apprehend our innovation to the question, and we don't pay attention to it. I don't know. I think food is a fascinating path.
It is a fascinating, yes, it is. And I like the discussion about the street foods, etc. When I get into West Africa, for example, it's a fascinating thing, because all of a sudden you have these small street restaurants that literally emerge, and eating in those contexts is different from eating at home. It's a different practice altogether. Yeah. Let me stop here. I will come back. There are a couple of issues I want to talk about later on, about how your project is similar or different from what Mignolo is talking about. But let me leave that for the time being. Raphael, do you want to hand over? I want to hand over to you.
Yes, thank you. I am very much interested in hearing about Mignolo's project in comparison to Maria Paula Meneses as well. And also, I'm interested in hearing the contributions of the participants of today's sessions to our discussion. But while I allow them more time to formulate their questions and comments, I'd like to ask a question myself.
Yeah.
So, Maria Paula, In your text, Tastes, Aromas, and Knowledges, you write about the tension between written and oral knowledges and about Santos' call for the monumentalizing the written text. I wonder if you could expand a bit on this notion of the monumentalizing the written text. And also, I wonder if you have any piece of advice for early career scholars like me when it comes to trying to solve the tension between the monumentalizing the written text and having to produce texts that follow canonical format of academic texts, many times a requirement in many academic circles, grant applications, for example, certain journals, and so on.
Thank you, Rafael. It's a very good question. The problem between the written and the oral is that most of our knowledge is oral, and then we have to codify. There is an interesting case now going on in Mozambique. There are $2 billion that were stolen from the public expenses, and now the trial is open to everybody. And sometimes I dare to listen, and each session, which lasts for 10 hours, have to be resumed in 5 or 6 pages. So that is my problem. How does a judge summarizes all that discussion and presentation in, because it's a very interesting exercise, because they have to agree on the precise words, but it's also an exercise of resuming. So diversity, when somebody faints, when somebody doesn't feel well, when somebody asks to step out to pray, all these things are not in the resume of the trial, and it becomes something very formal that we are expecting the defendant claim this and so on. So all the life, the density, that what makes us live is not there. So it becomes a monument to the state that functions that way. So if you look at that trial, you'll understand that it's a trial like any other trial in the world. And I think once you start unpacking and listening to one of these episodes, they eat there, they discuss about the food, if the food is okay or not, where do the judges eat, where does the prosecutor eat, the problems if they are, the food is poisoned or not. So all these things, you listen to them, but they are not in the written record. So the written is about the formality that's important for that case. When I was studying in the Soviet Union, most of our exams were oral. And for me, it was very interesting because it allowed us to interact with the professor, to interact with the students, and to ask things that sometimes would make sense and even helped us, because we were very young, to make sense of some of the interconnections that we sometimes didn't figure out. So it's a way of creating dialogue and not imposing a norm that sometimes when you write, you have to write. I have a nephew in Mozambique that is always complaining about everything. And one of the things he was complaining about was that he had to learn how to write. Oh, he wasn't finishing primary school, how to write a small text about my vacations. I was trying to teach him, and then suddenly it struck me. We are writing an essay. My argument, the development, and conclusion. But when we talk, our conversations are circular, so they flow. And the text, it's, as Ortega Gasset would say, it's orthopedic, it's closed, it doesn't breathe. The literary texts do breathe, but most of our academic writing, it's very formal, I agree, and quite often, and that's my experience now working in Europe, which is not a very good one in some cases, is because most of the publications in Europe about Africa are owned by Elsevier and Taylor. And who sits in the boards, editorial board? Most of the writers are Africanists, not Africans. So there is a difference between having experienced life in the continent or doing just research about the continent. So sometimes when you, and then there is this pressure to be peer reviewed and to have your name there. So quite often they said, well, because you didn't cite this person and that person, that you add, so to rise the scale of interventions of these people. Whereas when you, and I think now the internet allows us to have more oral presentations where the conversation flows and we can be challenged by our colleagues that raise questions that we never thought about. Whereas in a text, either we say, I agree, I suggest small, if you are doing the peer reviewing, I suggest small changes, and that's it. So I understand you have to follow that path, which I think it's a very colonial path in the sense that it frames you beside a certain way of thinking that is quite often leaves out the density of the case. But those are the rules of the market. So
the rules of the market, yeah.
We have to play by the rules.
Thank you. Yes, that's how I feel as well. I see now that in the chat there is a couple of questions asked by Olusegun Soetan, and I'm going to read. The first question is, if food is an ontological framework to talk about history, can it also function analytically as a tool to unpack difference, especially class identity? And then the second question is eating food as a ritual and its quotidian performance is neutral, that is apolitical?
Good question. I don't think food is apolitical. For instance, I came to understand Bajij as a class-gender question because I was each day about 1.5 million people enter Maputo city to work. So I was very interested because one day I arrived early in the airport, so there was all these people walking into the city because there is the province and there is the city, the two with the same name. And I decided to ask a woman I know since long ago, whom I buy Bajij, to ask about the whole process. So Bajij allowed her to take, she's a single mother with 2 daughters, and it were the Bajij that allowed her to have money enough for her children to attend school and finish university. So she says, my 2 daughters, both economists, are the result of me selling Bajij here. But because of that, I really was interested. So I asked her for a couple of days to sit next to her, sing out the thing goes. So people arrive, she has to start preparing at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's for the pace to rise and so on. By 4 o'clock in the morning, she's frying them. So you can imagine how the time of rest is small in the family. And then by 4:30, she's outside her house selling Bajij for people that are entering the city to start working at 6 o'clock. So she sells Bajij with bread and tea. And it was really interesting regarding class, because there are 2 questions. People that enter are working class. They are people that work in the low levels of administration, workers, especially working in construction, and so on and so forth. So we could have lots of conversations about how hard life is, how important that food is, because it's powerful food to give you strength, because you have to work until 3 o'clock in the afternoon because we work on a full schedule from 7:30 until 3 o'clock. So you have really to eat, and they had left from 3 o'clock in the morning to be by 4:30 at the door of Dona Madalena to buy Bajij. But the other thing which was really interesting is that they looked at me and they said, wow, a mulatto woman now selling, life is becoming very hard. So you lost your job. Is the crisis also affecting you? And there was a point when I was like, okay, I'm not supposed to explain that I'm research because I don't want them to understand that I'm doing research about food. So I said, yeah, I'm here, I'm trying to understand. But for a long time, people really looked at me, and because of my Portuguese and all my manners, they would look and say like, oh, the life is really becoming very complicated. So we have this class thing, people lowering in this class structure because of the crisis the country is being affected. So yes, food shows class, food shows your approach to food, the way you cook, the way you present, the way you eat, because there are certain things that you can't eat, I'm sorry, with fork and a knife. They have to be eaten by hand. And quite often people who pretend to be upper class are eating things that can't be eaten by hand. They want to use a knife and a fork. So all these performative actions that show you quite often how awkward food can be in terms of define. You try to present yourself as being part of another context, and the things don't work. As an analytical question, yeah, I would say also, so you can use food to understand the analytical framework you are trying to analyze. But for me, food is the core, is not just the way to approach the question. I'm trying to understand the grammar of food in our lives, how it structures our connections, how we speak, how we behave, how we are really, as Professor Marconi was saying, what we eat is what we are. And especially what is fascinating is if you see the interconnections across the Indian Ocean, you'll see a lot of words that are common: Bajij, the Samosas, the papadams, the now I have a senior moment, but you have lots of products that either the names are similar, but above all, you taste them. And then you see, I know what this is. And this is a grammar that cannot be translated into words because each location has a name for it. But you taste and you know how the thing is prepared. And that is the amazing moment when you enter an unknown environment and it's already familiar because you know what is inside. And it's a way that I think we need to explore in order to approach as a network of connections through the sensory experience instead of just speaking or reading about the recipes. I don't know if I answer your questions, but.
Thank you. I will now move on to the question asked by Di Mohali, which in a way your previous response partly touched upon it, but the question that was asked before was about class identity. Now this one places emphasis on gender. And Di writes, in many cultures, especially in Africa, food is prepared by women, and African men love women who love to cook. Interestingly, modern gender discourses often strongly claim that cooking is genderless, that it is basic life skill, and that no gender should impose cooking on another because, well, 50-50. Are gender activists, the question goes, are they oversimplifying the relationship that African men have with food? Has academia thoroughly investigated why men love women who cook for them?
I have to admit, I love food. And when I'm stressed, that's what I usually do, is to cook, to release my stress. Because if you really want to cook, you have to be focused. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So in order to cut myself from the problems, I cook. When I was finishing my PhD, colleagues were thrilled because every day will be lots of food. And at the end, they were very sorry that I was ending my PhD because they said, well, now who is going to cook for us? And I said, well, it's time for me to go. I can send you the recipes, but that's it. So I enjoy cooking, but my daughter cooks much better than myself. She comes from one of those, from her father's side, from the north of Mozambique, where women really know how to cook. I cook well, but she's another dimension. And the interesting thing is that it's a position of power to know how to cook and how people really come to your house because they know how nice it is to come. Whenever we have, it's quite often that we have these gatherings where we discuss politics and family affairs and everything. And two things usually happen. There's sometimes this distinction, the difference between men in one side and women in the other. And that's, in my view, quite often is to be in the kitchen with women. It's a position of power because we decide who eats the best pieces, how we are going to separate who is going to do what. And in that sense, I think we are analyzing the gender questions from two wrong positions. One, it's this idea from the North that the kitchen, it's an oppression location for women. I think it can be an oppression, but it can also be a process of emancipation if we look at kitchen as a laboratory, as a place where the fundamentals of our life, care, love, interconnections are forged. The problem is the representation about the kitchen, about the food, and it indeed goes back to Plato, and other philosophers would say that eyes and listening would be the superior forms of reasoning, and all the others were inferior and proper of women. So we have to go back to the key philosophers and decontextualize some of the comments they made. The second element, it's also the question of time. And now in most of families, men and women, they both work. So there is a shortage of time to dedicate ourselves to cook all the time. I know how long it takes. So it's a request for men to be also present, to engage in that task. And some of my friends are very good cooks too, but some of them, they're a bit younger than myself, and they quite often say, well, we are the sons of the generation that carried out the liberation struggle in Mozambique, and our mothers taught us how important it is to cook. So it's no longer a question of shame to be called, oh, you are in the kitchen with women. It's a way of being part of the family. So they really cook very well. Some of them, I really go to their places. If they are cooking, if their wives are cooking, I'll say, oh, I have no time. No, I had eaten already. No need to bother. So it depends on the context. And I'm not sure that to claim to be out of the kitchen, it's a way of projecting an emancipatory project. I think we are taking it the wrong way. I could be mean in taking it, this comment, but I don't see it that way. I think it's men and women, although I don't agree when the big chefs are called, most of them are men. It shows that in the public sphere, women are still not recognized as fundamental pieces in the kitchen. And most of the recipes, they have been tasted and tried by these women since long ago, and then they are appropriated by these chefs. I love to watch these food shows. There are a lot of women doing them, but some of them are also by men, and I don't understand very well why the chefs are mostly men and not women, but I'm not going to go into those specific details of those discriminatory approach in the formal cuisine, haute cuisine struggles, because it's very particular, a class question.
Thank you, Maria Paula. Now we'll move on to ask the question asked by Guillermo Gomez Urego. How to conciliate, work around, challenge those colonial and extractivist practices within academia without burnout, but being able to affect the knowledge pool in a meaningful way, and at the same time being respectful and loyal to the people without whom your research would have been impossible?
Wow, thank you for the question. That's a question which is at the core of, I think, of our projects, not to be extractionist, to do research with people, not about people, to do meaningful research, which is in most cases exactly the opposite will of most of the academic research, which is research about people. But it also depends on the areas. From the epistemology of the self, we are defending that we need to co-create knowledge. There are different approaches, interpretations, positions in the world. The decolonial group, the group of indigenous people and First Nations in North America, the post-colonial discussions, the subaltern studies, the Southern theory, the question of demarginalization of Polantucci, decolonizing the mind. So people have been critical of all these aspects. And what I think that it's a little bit missing is that we always criticize the North, but we don't do alliances across the South. So it always reaffirms the centrality of the North. So if you go around and say, okay, food is important in all these contexts around the South, then the place where food as knowledge is not important is in the global imperial North. So it's a way of moving towards a new direction of research, of moving beyond this condition of subalternity by creating a province which is going to be the province of the imperial North, hopefully that will hopefully move away once all these questions will be tackled seriously, and they will perceive. When it is going to happen, I don't know. Hopefully I hope to be still a little bit alive to see it, but maybe not. We are entering a time in academia very complicated. As Gramsci would say, the old is dying and the new has yet to be identified where it is. I think we have to try to stick together instead of, we complain much more and we discuss more and reivindicate using Spivak's strategic essentialism much more among us than we do regarding the North. And I think that is a path to go. I understand the burnout. I understand all these problems. Try not to cook a little bit. Cook is very useful because you can chop, and when you chop, all your stress goes away, and you have to think about what you are doing, and especially know at the end that people will really appreciate your food because you care. So it's a way of constructing another perspective about knowledge and moving away from these stressful situations that it's the everyday life we have to experience. I'm sorry, but I understand your position. We have to go for other situations, but still a lot has yet to be moved to reach that point. I don't know, Guilherme, if I answer your question.
Thank you very much, Maria Paula. And the two questions asked by Cristina Severo also in a way touch on this idea of moving to a different perspective or a sort of epistemological shift. And I will read. Maria Paula, thanks a lot for your inspiring presentation and reflections. I really appreciate. I have two questions. How would the discussion on food look like from the perspective of starvation? In other words, is there a risk of romanticizing the role of food if we consider the context of scarcity? Mm-hmm. And then a question two is, do you think the history of food in colonial era would be the same if we took the Atlantic Ocean as reference to describe the colonial comings and goings between Africa and Americas?
Regarding the second question, I have not done research enough, so I can't answer. I know a little bit about my side of the continent, not enough about the Americas, especially because you have to understand that when the Portuguese Vasco da Gama arrived at Mozambican island, and it's useful to read the description by the chronists that were with him, it was a time of mesmerization. That's when, in my view, Europe entered modernity. It's when they entered the Indian Ocean and understood that there was another world, a global world, a world of interconnections, of world trade, exchange of foods, and so on. And they understood it. And they even went to perceive the world from the eyes of the locals, and not imposing a monolithic imperial narrative. It occurred later, the end of 17th, 18th century, because the strength of the connections and the knowledge circuits in the Indian Ocean were very powerful. So I think we have to also look at it in the Atlantic world. It is the connections across the Atlantic are essentially, as far as I understand, framed by the colonial project, slavery, and later on modern colonialism. So it has to be a bit different in that way. I didn't want to expose you to too much history, but it's really interesting because if you see the description, especially in Melinde, how he describes how he was, Vasco da Gama was received by the king of Melinde, it's absolutely an encounter of a superior that Vasco da Gama recognized as a superior to himself, the king. So the way he was dressed, the way he arrived, it has nothing to do with that narrative that 19th century the explorers of the continent decided to draw, that these people are naked, they don't know what they are doing, and so on and so forth. And I think the recent Nobel Prize of Literature, Gurna, has quite some interesting texts analyzing literature about the Indian Ocean that shows that complexity of the Indian Ocean vis-a-vis the Atlantic Ocean. So that's my first, your second question. Regarding the first one, you are right about starvation, but scarcity of food is not the meaning of starvation. We can have little food, but do a lot with it. And we have to understand what is scarcity of food. Because one of the things I learned, and we went through the Civil War and scarcity of food, is that you have to permanently recycle the food. There is nothing left. Everything has a meaning to go on. And one of the things that really surprised me when I went on to study in the Soviet Union and later on in the US is how much food is left without being recycled. So we would have beef steak for lunch and then it will transform into small things, meatballs or something. And then my mother still would eat it to do pie. So it will know that for the whole week there'll be things around it, so we could almost foresee what was going to be. And we were a middle class family. There was scarcity of food because of the war, because of apartheid South Africa, but the notion of starvation, it's a limit condition in my view. Starvation is what I saw in certain areas of Mozambique when there was absolutely no food and no access to food for the next times. The other thing that I also think it's important is that this modern colonial capitalist approach imposed a very reduced menu available to people. When I was doing research for my PhD a long time ago, it was the end of the Civil War. People were returning to their locations, but at the same time, we were trying to understand what were the reasons that led to low vitamin deficiency in several kids. And one of the things we understood is that the boys are supposed to take care of the cattle. And while they are taking care of the cattle, they eat a lot of berries and fruits which are available. So that is not part of the menu that the mother gives to the son. It's part of the knowledge that the boys get across their generation. So they all know what can be eaten and they will survive on it until they go home and they eat it. So one of the things we noticed, and when they become refugees in refugee camps inside the country, there was no option for them of eating these fruits. And then the mothers had no idea that they had to give fruit. Although the fruits were available, were part of the package, they were not given as important food staple to the kids. So we had to explain what was going on and to tell those mothers that they had to give. Sometimes there will be weird fruits. There will be apples sent from South Africa and all strange stories, but that's the way we had to tackle the questions, to educate people about the new context and how the new context implies other food strategies. The second question is quite often when there is a war, and I've been seeing it here now in Europe with refugees, I've come across people that have they were born in refugee camps. So they have absolutely no idea what is a viable meal, what should be inside the meal, because they were born, brought up, and now they have kids in refugee camps. So how can they have an idea about what is a normal food, a normal meal, or a meal with all the elements, if they were brought up in these very weird conditions, which I don't wish for anyone, but unfortunately are very often spread across our continent and beyond. And the third element regarding scarcity that we also have to bear in mind is the extreme climate events. I'm very sorry that we could not come to a more comprehensive agreement at COP26, because we are having lots of extreme climate events like the Kenneth cyclone in Mozambique that really put people to risk. And sometimes that is just to finish the story. I was really shocked because at that time we had established a network of information to share the food that was very quickly prepared in Maputo to reach by car and by boat, but there was no capacity to reach the place where people were because of the floodings. And it was really a nightmare because there was lots of food 10 kilometers away. The problems that we didn't have access to that food. So we have really to understand what was more needed at that time was a boat and not food. So there was some colleagues saying, no more food, please send us a boat. We need a boat to get the food across. So there are lots of questions that contextually we will understand. But when you see the broad picture, people would say, oh, cyclone, we need to send food. The food arrived, but there was no boat to get the food to the people. So those will be some of the small questions that I think can help you think through food in these conditions. But I think the idea of starvation also has to deal with FAO. I have a big problem with FAO. FAO has decided that there are 16 staple foods that are central in the world, and I totally don't agree with those 16 foods, because those 16 foods are the product of a very commercialized minded, which does not take into consideration all the resources that people use on their daily lives. Whenever I am with people outside Maputo, I always am eating different things that comes from different plants, whose names I don't know. I know the name in Latin and I don't know the local name, but they are not part of the project that FAO sends us, neither are the fruits nor the roots. So I think the approach FAO is taking and the food support food system for refugees and so on, it's a very north-oriented approach, which I think we need also to challenge.
Thank you very much. Before I pass on the word back again to Makoni for him to wrap up the discussion, I will read a comment written by Chanel in the chat, which builds on Christina's question. And Chanel writes, the starving student has become a central theme in South African universities, and the university's willingness to overlook this is problematic. As Magokwana asks, what is the ethics of teaching a hungry student?
Oh, that is a very important question. It's about what is a university, because university is not just about teaching, it's about perceiving the other as a human being, as myself. And in our continent, unfortunately, with all these structural adjustments and the cuts in budget, those things are not being taken into account. I understand perfectly what you are talking about. It happens. I've seen it, unfortunately, across the continent when we go to classes and students leave very early in the morning. And it's a class question because they live away, because they are poor and they have to find a place to live if they are not from the place where the university is. And quite often the hostels are not enough for the students. And food, to tell you the truth, is dreadful. I had to eat for a long time at university. Probably that's why I decided to cook and to go to friends' house to cook, even in times when there was scarcity of food, because we don't treat students as someone who deserves that. They are our future. They are going to be the ones that are going to replace us. So they need to be fed intellectually and in terms of substantial food, tasty food, interesting food, and eventually to use the food to tell students about sustainability, all these questions that we have to tackle. When I was a student a long time ago in Maputo, when we were socialists, one of the things we had to do was a day a week, we had to take one morning or one afternoon to work in the chambers for the production of the university. And it was a quite interesting exercise. I actually learned a lot about plants, although there were colleagues of mine that thought that they were intellectuals, they were not supposed to work in the fields. But I'm telling you, I think we need that part of that interaction. It's as part of our education to understand what means to produce, what means to educate ourselves, to respect plants. I did research about tea plantations in Mozambique. Now, to tell you the truth, until the tea is not white, I keep using the leaves because the quantity of work that is in every leaf of tea, it's amazing. So we have to learn to respect the life of these things, the political economy of food. And I would think that it's time for us to go back to this idea that we really need to reconnect with the land, with the places we belong to learn to taste, to smell, to feel the plants, the products, and to contribute to our. So we need libraries, and we also need to produce. So that has been my struggle in Mozambique until now, unsuccessfully. But I think it's relevant, and to learn how to compose the remains of our meals and so on, to think about through food about the environment.
Thank you. And Makoni, if I can ask you to wait a bit more, because I noticed that there was a question and a comment in the chat that I overlooked. I'm sorry, Adrian. I'm going to ask the question. Adrian writes that food, as Mary Douglas has shown, has cultural significance. It has symbolic meanings. Sometimes we don't understand what we are eating and why. We just like it because it's part of our culture. I may not have cheese in my refrigerator, but there will always be chili. With the increase in the global phenomenon, the question is, are our recipes losing their cultural and traditional flavor in the way they are cooked today?
I think I was trying in this presentation to show that food flows, and it goes across, and it's always the same but different. I can never cook the same curry with the same flavor if I'm preparing the masala myself. If I buy the masala, obviously it's going to taste the same, but I like to do the whole thing from scratch. So I think that tradition, it's a way of showing where we come from. So there'll be, I need to do a masala, but I can change the masala. So it's at the same time my root, but also my imagination of something else that I'm going to do. I'm a little bit concerned with this idea that we are going to be locked in the recipes. I usually read the recipe and then I move on to do it my way, because I always like to adjust. And I think most of us who don't copy the recipes, we do it our own way. And that's why we keep saying, oh, my mother does that very well, or my friend does that very well, because it's our personality also in the food. And regarding globalization, it started a long time ago. The idea of the curry is an absurd idea, because the curry is a British invention. And if you travel to Mozambique, curry, it's anything that we eat with ugali or with rice. So it's the sauce. It's the meaning of a sauce. It's not the curry that you find in England. So we have to be careful about the life of the words, because sometimes they change the track, they go into another thing. But the curry indeed are some leaves that are originally from Singapore, Sri Lanka, and so on, that someone by mistake decided to take the part by the whole. Someone that probably, in my view, never set the foot in the kitchen and did not understand what was at stake. that we're really talking about a masala, not about a curry. So curry, it's a British invention in my view. And I think this explains this idea about globalization. It also has to do a bit with even how our bodies react to food. For instance, my sister, she spent 3 years ago, a year with me in Coimbra. She was finishing a master, and we found out that she had problems eating bread because everything in Portugal has flour in it, wheat flour, and she's intolerant to it. Basically, it's because she's from Mozambique. She eats manioc, she eats maize. We don't eat a lot of wheat. So she was okay until she moved to Portugal. She's 40, that's suddenly the doctor was asking her, so you never found out about it? She said, no. Before, in times of scarcity during the Civil War, we had no wheat. And later on, I didn't want to eat wheat because I enjoyed other things. And only when I came to Portugal did I find out that I have an intolerance to wheat. So sometimes we also have to see that our body adjusts to certain regimes of food. And although we keep claiming that food can be global, quite often it's not. Our bodies are not prepared to take all of it because it's also another long-term adaptation of our bodies, and we have to see it. Now it's very fashion in Europe to see people are not, we don't have that sort of product. People are intolerant to this and that. We don't eat milk very often. In Mozambique, we don't use milk after the baby has left the breast of the mother. So there are lots of people who are intolerant to lactose because it's adaptation, human adaptation. So we have also to see these elements which are not, in my view, a global thing. I don't want to go into to say this is a genetic thing. It's more in the sense that we activate more enzymes throughout the time that are in our bodies because of the kind of food that our parents and we are used to since the beginning. It also has to do with it. I'm sorry, I'm being boring now because
no.
I know too much about food.
Very interesting. Thank you everyone for asking great questions and making interesting comments, especially Olusegun, Dee, Guillermo, Christine, Chanel, and Adrian. And thank you, Maria Paula, for engaging with them in such insightful ways. Makoni, would you like to share some final considerations?
Yes, I do. I want to ask a question that has always intrigued me, but I have never been able to. I've come across a couple of statements where, let's say, Bonaventura dos Santos is talking about the Southern Epistemologies, and he makes one or two comments that the Southern Epistemologies include colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism, and then he indicates that that is different from, let's say, the Decolonial project by Minolo, etc., etc. From your perspective as somebody who is immersed, let's say, in some of the work by Bonaventura dos Santos, which you are expanding, how different are these projects? What you guys are trying to do in Southern Epistemologies and what, let's say, Bonaventura and his team and his associates are trying to do. How do you see yourselves?
I think we are in the same, in that path of trying to put together in dialogue the different perspectives in the world that from one side criticizing the oppressions that have shaped the present, and these oppressions are contextual. I would say in my context, besides colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy, the different generations question across generations is very problematic.
Okay.
And the later on is religious conflicts. We can't not understand Mozambique without that question being brought to the picture. So it depends on the context and it depends on the time. The question, I think, which is important in my view, we are talking about similar topics with decolonial. I would say the difference with decolonial, they don't tackle history. So there is a very strong approach towards criticizing Europe, Eurocentrism, whereas from an historical perspective, I think our role is above all to reclaim, and now I'm following Senghor, early works of Senghor, to reclaim our humanity through the knowledge that we gave to the world. For example, we are using now computer programs that allow us to carry out this conversation in Zoom. And this is because the language is 0-1. It's the basic language in the programs. The number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is not European. It's Phoenician and later on spread to Arabs and Muslims. And the 0 is present in 3 big civilizational projects. None of them is European. So if we're going to say that this is not knowledge world, then what it is. So it's going back also to the history and to reclaim what has been stolen, negated, depreciated as part of our contribution, as I was trying to show with And the second element is that there is a very strong, I think, focus on a very strong class Marxist approach through labor and slavery, whereas I think colonialism has to be tackled, that is my personal opinion, as an exercise, and I'm trying to follow Césaire, Fanon, and so on, the negation of the other as a subject of knowledge. So we are never allowed to enter the big room of science, because science is a product of a certain context. So the epistemologies of the South is to say that there are different forms of understanding the world. Every knowledge is limited in the way of addressing. Let's talk among ourselves, between the decolonial with the Southern theories, with Ubuntu and so on, and avoiding all that way of attempting from one side to essentialize that experience as incapable of being talked across, and from another side, which is also one of the traps of modernity, to transform a part in the whole, saying post-colonial studies is the only approach to understand colonialism. No, we have to see the different reflections, and I was giving some examples happen in the world, and to create dialogues, because you, Professor Macon, you know African history as well as I do. And when the countries in Latin America were living towards independence, when most of our countries were experiencing the emergence of effective colonial administrative presence. So we can't compare the two situations immediately, because in order to discuss the context, in order to democratize history, you have to understand the history of each of these regions to create dialogues among ourselves. Otherwise, I'm just imposing my narrative about Mozambique in replicating an imperial moment. I hope I didn't sound very imperial today. But,
yeah.
But that's the way I see the thing, the differences. But I understand why they are talking that way.
Yeah.
But we need to talk among ourselves, like the subaltern studies, which are very important.
That's true.
When we have colleagues who are Dalit, they are going to say yes, but you are talking that you are not listened to, but still you produce knowledge, whereas you recognize us as subjects of knowledge. So these are sensible.
That's interesting, because my vision of what we're trying to do, for example, in our small space where we have invited you, is to then explore the implications, let's say, of Southern epistemologies or decolonial approaches, but focusing to some extent on the discipline where some of us come from, let's say language in education, etc., etc. That's why your conversation is very interesting to think about food ontologies and language, etc. Because it provides us with opportunities to create more diction, more conceptual ways of understanding what we are trying to do. And then my last question, which I like quite a lot about what you're trying to talk about when you're dealing with responding to Chanel's question about students, that I think you're right, that what has tended to happen is that scholars and university administrators overlook the fact that students need to eat, and they need to eat well. I did my first degree in Ghana, and at that time the dining halls were not working. I mean, they're not functioning. So we had to go out and buy food and eat and all that. And it took a lot of time. And when we are giving students assignments and all that, we never seem to think that they need time to go and eat, and they need to eat well. Right, right. So, in other words, what we need to think about is how to create what you can call a counter university within a university. A counter university, in my mind, is one that tries to look at what students do holistically, from what they drink or what they eat, etc. Because all those things have an impact on what they are willing to learn. A hungry student is not likely to pay much attention to what you are talking about. Right? Yeah. Anyway, this has been a very, very interesting conversation about this, and I must thank you very much for finding the time. And for me, having grown up in Zimbabwe, in the eastern part of Zimbabwe, Mozambique always looked like neighbors across the road, right? I have a lot of friends who went. They were trained by Samora Machel, and they came and they were fighting in Mozambique, and they came back home, and they're always talking about their Mozambican experiences.
You are more than welcome to come, and I promise a very good lunch with my daughter.
Yes, that would be good.
She really cooks well. I'm not.
Yes, I can promise you this. I don't know how to cook well, but I know how to eat well.
That is also an art.
Yes, thank you very much, Raphael. And then Kim, you want to announce our next session?
Yes, thank you so much. So we have another session tomorrow, actually. Tomorrow, November 20th at 9 a.m. We'll have Molefe Kete Asante from Temple University join us. And then Penn State is going on a short break for the American holiday of Thanksgiving next week. So we will return on December 3rd with Yasir Suleiman. And that time is TBD. So keep an eye on your email and we'll let you know what time that's at. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much to everybody. Right.